All right, this next video is going to be probably one of the hardest, but one of the most influential ones that will give you a lead up when you're running or when you're running a team or just in leadership in general. And that is the idea of extreme ownership. So ownership equals influence. If you want to change something, you have to own it. You have to take responsibility for it, right? If you want to change it, it must be your responsibility. It's so easy to, when something goes wrong, to blame your team or to blame your boss or to blame someone else. But when you do that, if you don't own it, you don't have any influence over it. So if your team is not hitting their KPIs, it's your responsibility to fix it. If your boss doesn't like you, it's your responsibility. If your department didn't hit their sales target, it's your responsibility. Because what happens is if your team isn't hitting their KPIs and it's their fault, there's nothing you can do to fix it. If your boss doesn't like you and it's your boss's problem, then there's nothing that you can do to fix it, and the same thing with your department. And so the what you really want to do is how you want to look at these issues is if your team isn't hitting their KPIs and it's your responsibility to fix it, what can you be doing to help your team hit those KPIs, right? All that problem solving and all that education really comes into play here, but you really want to take ownership. If your team is making mistakes, then you want to take ownership over it so that you can fix it because ownership is influence. If your boss doesn't like you, what can you do that will fix it? Yeah, maybe your boss is in the wrong in not liking you, or maybe your team is being foolish and not hitting their KPIs, but there's always something that you can do that can influence the situation for the better. And so taking ownership, or extreme ownership in this case, this is your path to making those changes. It's a lot of responsibility. It can be tough, but this is how you really set yourself up for success and how you stand out far more than any other more experienced leaders around you. Now, another thing that I really want to bring up with this concept is you might need to balance this with what I call the principle of indirect gains. And this is where education might need to come in. So let me give you an example because it's going to make more sense that way. So let's say your team is not hitting their KPIs. Your initial thinking might be, oh, okay, if they're not hitting their KPIs, then I need to get on them harder for working harder and all of that. Now, that could be the case, but that might be too direct and that might not be the actual problem. And so, with the principle of indirect gains, you might actually gain that outcome by focusing on something else indirectly. So, for example, if your team isn't hitting their KPIs because they're not working hard enough, maybe you need to, maybe go one of two ways. Maybe you need to set the example of working extremely hard and being extremely disciplined, or if maybe that'll solve the problem. Every team and every problem is different. Or maybe it's the opposite. Maybe you need to actually create an environment where your team can relax a little bit more and where they're not so stressed, and then it makes them easier to hit their KPIs and to make less mistakes, or whatever the key performance indicator is. And so that's the principle of indirect gains, where it may not be what directly affects this that actually solves it. It may be something a little more indirect that solves this. For example, I'll give you another one. Your boss doesn't like you, right? If you go directly to your boss and be like, "Why don't you like me?" They might just deny it, and that makes it really difficult for you to solve. Versus the indirect gains, maybe there are things that you can tell that your boss appreciates, and you do that a lot more, and then indirectly that increases, their responses to you. And so the principle of indirect gains is really important in this, right? When you have a team, just hitting them over the head over and over again on their mistakes typically doesn't work well with humans. And so you may want to try other avenues. And this is again where the education comes in, right? If you're on LinkedIn Learning or you're on Udemy and you're reading books on leadership and on team development, you'll see that very often where hitting people over the head with this stuff isn't going to be what works. But that is extreme ownership and the principle of indirect gains as it relates to leadership. And again, ultimately, if you want to change something, if you want that influence, you need to take ownership of it.